When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the fourth living being say, "Come." And I looked up and saw a horse whose colour was pale green. Its rider was named Death, and his companion was the grave. These two were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with the sword and famine and disease and wild animals. When the fourth seal is opened, the last cherubim calls forth a pale green horse, an image that represents death. Thankfully, I've never seen a dead body in the flesh, but I'm told that this is the colour that corpses turn. In other words, as a result of all this war, economic troubles, famine, diseases, and natural disasters, death will inevitably follow hard on the heels of all those things. Now, when it says, these two were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, this is often interpreted as a quarter of the planet's population will die. It may not mean that. It could just mean, and I think this is the more likely explanation, that a quarter of the Earth's geographical area is going to be particularly badly affected, like the Middle East, for example. Now that we've looked at the first 4 seals, it might be useful if we put them side by side with the Olivet Discourse. By doing so, we'll discover that they mirror each other almost exactly. During the Olivet Discourse, the first sign that Jesus gave was false messiahs, false prophets, and false religion. So it's interesting that when we turn to the first seal in Revelation, we see a white horseman representing false messiahs, false prophets, and false religion. The second sign that Jesus gave was an increase in wars and threats of war. Again, when we turn to the second seal in Revelation, we read about a red horseman who has authority to take peace from the earth, and of war and of slaughter. The third thing that Jesus talks about on the Mount of Olives is famines and earthquakes all over the world. So when we turn to the third seal, we read about a black horseman who causes economic crises and famine in the world. The fourth thing that Jesus talked about in the Olivet Discourse was persecution, suffering, and death for following him. And again, when we turn to the fourth seal, we read about a pale green horseman representing death and the grave. There seems to be quite a clear correlation between the two passages, and if it's a valid comparison to make, we should also note that around the third seal, marked by economic collapse and famine, Jesus tells us there will be an increase in natural disasters. Here's a graph from the International Disaster Database that illustrates how this is happening right now. Scientists warn that this trend is going to continue in the years ahead, attributing the phenomenon to man-made climate change. While the theory of man-made climate change is debatable, the Bible makes it clear that they're right to predict increased volatility in the natural world. Every time you turn on the news and see a tsunami, a flood, an earthquake, or a hurricane causing devastation in some part of the world, you're actually witnessing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And that raises an important question. Where exactly are we in the prophecy timeline? We've seen there will be an increase in false prophets and religion, and that's already happening. We've seen there will be an increase in wars, and that's already happening. We've seen there will be an increase in economic crises, food poverty, and wealth disparity, and that's already happening. And we've seen there will be an increase in natural disasters and disease, and that's already happening too. With this in mind, I believe that we can legitimately entertain the idea that the first 4 seals have already been opened and we're already experiencing the beginning of the birth pains. The news channels seem to confirm this with every passing day. Many people want to know where we are in the timeline of events and how long we have to wait until Jesus returns. No one can answer that question accurately. However, Jesus did tell us that we would be able to discern when the time was approaching. He said, "Now learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you can know that his return is very near, right at the door." Since we can indeed observe all these things happening in our world right now, we might not be at the end, but we can say with a certain degree of confidence that we're at the beginning of the end. And although we don't know how long the birth pains will last, we can say with some justification that they've already begun. That should focus our minds as we consider how to live in the times ahead. When the fourth seal is broken and there's an increase in death in the world, it appears as though that's especially going to be true for Christians. Jesus says during the Olivet Discourse, "Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. As we've already noted, while that has always been true, while Christians have always been hated, persecuted and martyred for their faith throughout history, there will be a noticeable increase towards the end. In the same way that there have always been false prophets, but they're going to increase. In the same way that there's always been wars, but they're going to increase. In the same way that there's always been financial difficulties and famines, but they're going to increase. In the same way that there's always been natural disasters, but they're going to increase. There's always been persecution for being a Christian, but it's going to increase significantly. In fact, this may even be describing a kind of end-time genocide. Earlier, I quoted the International Society for Human Rights, the secular observatory based in Frankfurt, Germany, who said that 80% of all acts of religious discrimination in the world today are now directed at Christians. Statistically speaking, that already makes Christians by far the most persecuted religious body on the planet, right now, today. The Spectator recently published an article which said, in effect, the world is witnessing the rise of an entire new generation of Christian martyrs. The carnage is occurring on such a vast scale that it represents not only the most dramatic Christian story of our time, but arguably the premier human rights challenge of this era as well. Even places which were relatively safe for Christians are now becoming dangerous. In Iraq, Christians numbered 1.5 million in 1991. Today it's estimated that their number is closer to 150,000. That represents a 90% decrease in just over 20 years. No wonder some experts are predicting the extinction of Christianity from the Middle East. And then in other parts of the world, stories like these are increasingly common.
They know that we are Christians. I am a Christian. That is why you are here to attack me. He said, yes, I told you, we've been telling you people to convert to Islam, but people refuse. So the only thing is to get rid of all of you and inherit all that you have. If you women say you will not convert to Islam and marry us, then we'll kill all of you, even you and your children and your daughters.
We started the praise and worship, not even 5 minutes into it. All of a sudden we heard someone screaming. Suddenly we saw this stranger, walking in, and my younger brother, he was there, and he went to ask him what's wrong. He all of a sudden started punching him in the face.
I was trying to stop them, but they pushed me hard.
They were shouting and saying that stop this church and we don't want to hear all this nuisance.
Christians are being chased, hounded, persecuted and killed in increasing numbers all over the world. This is a catastrophe of biblical proportions, literally. Even in the West, we're seeing a noticeable rise in anti-Christian, anti-Christ sentiment. Reports are coming through with increasing regularity of home churches being shut down, street preachers being jailed under hate speech charges for saying that Jesus Christ is Lord, Christian business owners being targeted for opposing homosexuality, and all mentions of God being removed from schools and halls of government. Right now, the persecution in the West hasn't led to waves of martyrdom or even much physical violence. But just as Nero's persecution of the Christians began small, confiscation of property, illegalization of the faith and imprisonment, and then escalated, that's how waves of martyrdom generally begin. We must stay vigilant as antichrist sentiment rises in the world. Anyone who has studied German attitudes towards the Jews in the 1930s will know that this is exactly how the Holocaust began too. At first it was just a whispering campaign, verbal abuse, then boycotts on Jewish businesses, confiscation of property and vandalization of homes. Before long, they were being blamed for all of society's ills, just as Nero had blamed Christians for all of Rome's, and they were being carted off to concentration camps and gas chambers. We must not be complacent. Anti-Christian sentiment will certainly increase and get more severe as we get closer to the time of the Antichrist himself. Jesus says that many will buckle under the increasing pressure of this hatred from the world and will renounce their faith for the sake of comfort. He says, many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. Others will leave Christ to follow the proliferation of false prophets who will tickle their ears with promises of an easier life. Sin will increase, immorality will increase, Christians will increasingly stand out, be excluded and looked down upon. It's going to take an increasing amount of courage to stand up for Jesus in the world, However, Jesus says that those who endure to the end will be saved. He doesn't mean that they will necessarily have their earthly lives spared, just that they will gain everlasting life for their faithfulness to him, even to the point of death. Obviously, this means that the cowards who capitulate and do not endure to the end will not be saved. I'll repeat what I said and stay free. It is possible to renounce your faith, walk away, and forfeit your salvation. We must endure. Now, all this persecution and killing of Christians should help us understand the next seal in the sequence. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of all who had been martyred for the word of God and for being faithful in their testimony. They shouted to the Lord and said, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you judge the people who belong to this world and avenge our blood for what they have done to us? Then a white robe was given to each of them, and they were told to rest a little longer until the full number of their brothers and sisters, their fellow servants of Jesus who were to be martyred, had joined them. Here we see the martyred souls of Christians filling up heaven. This lends weight to the theory that the rise in Antichrist sentiment will eventually lead to a genocide. The tribulation of the last days will culminate in a great tribulation of martyrdom for the church. Since the fourth seal, which brought the rider called Death, affected only a fourth of the earth, this probably isn't a global genocide, but certainly it will affect a large part of the planet. This may even describe the virtual extinction of Christianity from the Middle East that some suggest has already begun. It's certainly in keeping with the Spectator article that suggests a new wave of Christian martyrdom has started there. At any rate, we shouldn't be complacent, believing that this will only affect our Middle Eastern brothers and sisters. We may all be asked to lay down our lives for the name of Christ in the years to come. It would do us good to prepare for this sobering eventuality, and to pray for those who are already suffering. John describes the martyrs in heaven shouting out to the Lord to give them justice. They ask him how long it will be before he pours out his judgment on their murderers. However, there are still 2 more seals to break before the scroll can be opened and God's wrath can be read and enacted. The martyred souls are given white robes, which will help us identify them later, and are told to wait just a little while longer.